gang. It's time for a great reset. A neck reset. In the last year or so, I think we've touched on the time frame or the lifespan of the typical flat top acoustic guitar and how certain changes are predictable. It's like with an auto mechanic. You start to understand after you've seen a number of cars come through the shop when a certain component is likely to fail and when the service is going to be needed. Neck angle plays an important role in the playability of any guitar, and it changes over time as the string tension takes a toll. Different guitar makes and models shift at different rates, it seems, depending on the materials, how they go together. There are variables like the gauge of string that's used and how often the neck is adjusted, even the ambient conditions it's living in. But generally speaking, it's a predictable process. The initial setup of the guitar can affect the schedule as well. If it left the factory with extremely low action and a very tall saddle, we would expect it would probably take longer for the string height to become unplayable in a way that we couldn't remedy by lowering the saddle at the bridge, which is something we expect to happen a couple of times over the life of the instrument. In my experience, where I live, most Martin dreadnoughts are going to be ready for a reset around 30 to 35 years of age. Gibsons seem to take a little bit longer, say 35 to 40 years on average. Why is that? Could be the shape of the body. The sloped shoulder designs on Gibsons are probably a bit stiffer than what you see here with the straight 90-degree entry against the neck. Could be the little bit of extra arch in Gibson tops that they use, or a slightly thicker back. In this case, we've got a guitar with a solid top and sides and a laminated back, which is a little bit different. This is a late 70s Gibson Gospel guitar. Not the flashiest model, but just a good, serviceable instrument. This has a maple neck, solid spruce top, maple back and sides, with the back being laminated, as I said. These were produced between 1972 and 79. They went away for a while and were brought back in 1992 and made until 97. But their second iteration was all mahogany, including the top. And the performer most known for using one of those is the singer-songwriter Phoebe Buffay, who sang Smelly Cat. It might be difficult to see, but these have a bit more of an arch in the back, kind of violin-like. It's not a continuous catenary curve or anything. It's got something of a recurve around the perimeter. More arch than the standard Gibson J series, and a lot of people respond well to these guitars. People who have them really like them, and it's a good sounding guitar. The owner has been holding off on doing the neck reset for a few years, but he thinks it's time. I think at some point the bridge on this was shaved down a little bit. The thing is, the sound is good, and we don't really want to change it, so we're going to keep the lower bridge, not replace it, and just tip the neck enough to suit a slightly taller saddle and a better action. If we like the way something sounds, it makes sense to keep things the same as much as possible. The action on this is 8/64ths on the bass side, 6/64ths on the treble. You can really feel the 6. Anything more than about 5, and it starts to get really stiff feeling. So it's time. The relief in the neck is around 16 or 17 thousandths, which is more than I would like to see, so we'll adjust the truss rod if we can. Something that was interesting to me is I see what looks like a bit of a crack just in front of the bridge pin holes, which isn't completely unexpected. But on closer inspection, it seems that that is actually a plug, which was carefully routed and inserted into the bridge. The thing is, the saddle is so low that you've got this issue happening. The strings are basically straight from where they exit the bridge over top of the saddle. So there's not a whole lot of downward pressure there. We'll see if there's any adjustability left in the truss rod here. Anytime you see a bunch of exposed thread past the end of the nut, start to be a little concerned. So my first turn is going to be loosening it. That feels alright. That's back to where we were. Okay, so there is some adjustability. I've given it about maybe 1/8 of a turn there. Let's see what happened. That improved things by about 0.03. So let's see if there's a bit more in there for it to give. Okay. That's probably as much as I'll do for now. 1/4 of a turn is a substantial adjustment, and I want to get the neck used to this new configuration. There's also some fairly heavy grooving going on in the lower positions here, especially that B string. That's worn quite a ways in. We'll see what the actual fret height is like, and we may have to replace the first 3 or 4 frets. It looks like someone's been here on the nut doing some of the super glue and baking soda trick to increase the height of the nut slots. The clearance is okay right now. If we do go ahead and replace the first few frets, that might have to change, as plenty of clearance here might not be any clearance at all if this fret was at full height. Yeah, this is a very strange thing to me. I had a look on the inside, and there's no serious damage to the bridge plate, despite the fact that it being a 70s plywood style plate with the double X brace. This is one of the guitars that has the main X and a secondary one down here. But yeah, that's funny. The string spacing is quite narrow on this. It's 51 millimeters, it's 2 inches, which is substantially tighter than you'd find on a Martin of a similar size. I'll measure where the straight edge meets the front of the bridge here with and without string tension to see what the top does under pressure. It dips about a 32nd of an inch with the string tension on, which is pretty typical for a guitar of this size. Every time I show this thing, someone asks, what is that thing and where did you get it? This is a sealing iron, as in sealing a package. And the brand name on this one is Hanger 9. I think it's sold through like a model making company. I'm sure there are plenty of others, likely all made in the same facility, just branded with different brand names. It's nice in that it's just the right size for this job. It's got the internal rheostat so that, you know, you can dial in the heat that you like. There are other ways of doing this. People use heat lamps, like the Old Country Buffet. Did you try the lasagna tonight? It's my favorite. Of course, you got to protect the guitar top when you're using a heat lamp. Or purpose-built, like silicone heat blankets. Most of the Luthier suppliers, or rather, not most of them, but Luthier's Mercantile International sells those, designed for this job. So I just put this on here, being careful, obviously, not to leave it unattended. Turn it up to about 250, 275, and then usually takes about 15 minutes or so for it to get warm enough, and then I just start working at it with the palette knives. Again, there are purpose-built knives for this as well, but I've just always used these inexpensive artist palette knives. This one I've had for 20 years, and it's getting kind of rumpled. But I thin them out slightly, like I sand the edges with some 120 grit on a flat block, and sort of, I mean, they're not razor sharp, but they're quite thin on the edge. It helps get under the board. And so the goal is, of course, to loosen the entire thing from stem to stern, all the way up to the 14th fret here. Just be gentle. Gotta be careful, because on some soundboards there might be cracks under the fingerboard extension, or even a seam separation in the top. And if you're, you know, being too aggressive, you could catch the end of the knife in that, and it tends to dive down into the top at that point, which is no good. So, you gotta be sort of gentle. It takes as long as it takes, you know. While it's still hot, I'll go ahead and pull out the 15th fret here. The old ebony here feels like it wants to lift, so I'm going to go ahead and use this fret pull device. Should be able to reuse this, so I mark the bass side so I know which way it goes back in. I'm drilling an access hole, and immediately notice a little chip that needs to be glued down. So I get after that right away before I forget or lose the pieces. And then drilling proceeds. On a lot of Gibsons, the front of the dovetail is just past the 15th fret, so a slight angle of the drill will find the air gap, goes right in. And you can see that I angle the drill to mimic the shape of the heel, so the two holes converge. It's nice when it's that easy. A couple of things to consider before I tried pulling the neck off this thing. Number one is occasionally Gibson would spray lacquer over top of both the neck and the body at the same time as they'd been previously assembled. Sometimes there is a line of lacquer that needs to be cut through along the edges, and occasionally sometimes they got glue on the front face of the heel, which is not great. Not much I can do with that at this moment, but it would be good to cut through the lacquer. The other thing is we've got one of those heels that if you were a repair person you would never design, because it is slanting. It slants forward quite a ways. It's a dramatic angle, and I know that if I put this in my neck removal jig and try to push on this, something bad's going to happen. So I got to come up with some means of padding this out so that I end up with something that's kind of level with the back. Yeah, there's a pretty good fillet of lacquer there in the corner that does have to be scored through. It wouldn't be strong enough by itself to hold the neck up from coming loose, but it would possibly break in unpredictable ways. Yeah, this is a really stupid heel because it's not flat in any plane. It's kind of domed. This is going to be fun. This is peel and stick sandpaper. I know it seems bizarre, but it's actually necessary. I gotta fit this thing fairly close because I'm gonna glue it in place and rely on it sort of staying there. I have to drill a hole in this block to accept the end of this 1/4-20 threaded bolt so that it'll be less likely to slip off or get pushed aside when I start putting the tension on. It'll capture it in position, basically. Okay, again, sorry to people who watch a lot of these videos, but I have to say it every time, otherwise I get hit with a dozen emails. These are electric foam cutters. You can do a search for foam cutters online and find them. There are inexpensive versions available on Amazon. These are from a place called Hot Wire Foam Factory in California. They're higher quality. These are 4-inch hot knives, and they're powered by simple DC plug-in adapters. I think they're 6-volt. They also sell variable power supplies that go with these so you can vary the heat. I just plug them right in and use them at full power. Takes about 10 minutes, and the necks are usually free, ready to pop off. So these are in pretty close contact with the end of the dovetail and the front of the neck block. They're pumping a lot of heat into what is essentially a big wooden heat sink. The neck is absorbing it. It's spreading around to all those areas that have glue on it. At a certain point it'll develop enough of a heat buildup that the glue will start to re-liquefy, basically. And in a few minutes here I'm going to put some more pressure on the end of the neck, which will basically want to make that dovetail joint slip against itself and pop free. It doesn't look like the adhesive on the tape is strong enough. It's just slid right off the end of the heel. Hopefully we're getting enough pressure on there. We'll see. It's so nice not having to use steam for this. You know, it just comes apart without the kind of hassle. Like, I don't feel nearly as anxious as I used to when I had to use steam. It's a fairly nicely fit dovetail. This says November something 1977B. Calamity. The extra pressure pushed the bolt through the caul and it made a divot. This cloth is dipped in distilled water. You can use tap water, but if it's got, well, various things in it. Maple is very prone to staining. If it gets anything like iron on it, it's sort of a blue stain, which would be kind of unfortunate. So the distilled water doesn't have any mineral content in it. That bounced back pretty nicely. There's a little bit of torn grain there. It looks dark at the moment, but I think it will lighten up upon drying, and then I'll put a little lacquer on that and it will be almost good as new. We're in the era of that funny white glue. I'm slightly undercutting the face of the heel, proportionally deeper at its end. This speeds up the refitting process. I don't go too deep, just a slight hollow is all that's necessary. The end grain of maple is not the funnest thing in the world to try and cut. There is a fingerboard crack that runs alongside the pickguard here, all the way between the block, and it actually breaks through the front edge of the sound hole there. So we definitely have to fix that before we go too far. I'm going to glue it up, and I'm going to put a couple of cleats on the inside around the sound hole there. This is a piece of spruce soundboard material. It's about 70 thousandths, which is slightly more than a millimeter and a half. It's like 1.6 millimeters. I'm going to butt that up against the brace, and the grain is running counter to the soundboard. Sort of find a spot there where we're kind of bisecting the crack. And cut that off. I got some glue in the crack, and I'm using a rod clamp here to draw it in. And then I'll glue in the cleat. Just checking the alignment here with a mirror. I'm re-angling the heel, sanding a wedge of material off its face, and tipping the neck back. I sand an equal number of strokes from each side, being careful to get rid of the dust between each stroke. This is a much longer process than I make it look in any of these videos. I usually have to take a break about halfway through to rest my hands and my mind. At a certain point, sanding the sides no longer accomplishes anything, and I have to then take material from the center of the heel because it's remaining there and it's holding the neck away from the body. So it's this dance back and forth between the sides and the end of the heel. I'm also constantly checking the angle of the fingerboard relative to the height of the bridge. We seem to be just about there. When enough has been removed to fix the angle, the dovetail will no longer be snug in the pocket, so I'll have to make a shim. Here I'm scraping some veneer down to precisely 8 thousandths of an inch. How do I know the thickness? Well, I test fit with a feeler gauge. I frequently check the run of the strings using some dental floss to make sure that the neck is aligned properly before glue up. Here I'm making a fingerboard extension wedge by scraping and then sanding. This is glued to the bottom of the fingerboard. Sometimes I'll glue this after the neck has been attached to the body, sometimes before. Just depends on the situation, how big the wedge is and that kind of thing. Then I trim it back, and I'll sand it and then stain it to match the fingerboard. When everything has been test fit, the glue up goes very quickly. Just put some glue on it and slap a clamp on. These frets are quite low and also quite narrow for Gibson, being slightly less than 80 thousandths. They actually look wider than they are. It's kind of an optical illusion. Gibson never crowned these frets. I mean, they'd go over them with the leveling beam and then just, take some sandpaper and knock the sharp corners off. So you end up with very wide tops to them. And of course, they only get wider and flatter as they go. So, the first three are pretty munched, and the B string has worn away basically to the fretboard, as these things are only 25 to 30 thousandths tall. So we should get rid of those. Here's a better shot of the damage. I'll heat the frets up and pull them out. I'm cleaning out the slots. I can feel these are a little wider than usual, and that's confirmed when I try a test fit. It wants to fall right out. This is a little fret Tang expander I made out of a discarded pair of end nippers. The top jaw is roughly triangular in section, and that engages with a little notch on the bottom jaw. So when I grab the fret between the jaws on the Tang here, a little bit of pressure, and it will expand the Tang, pushing it out in the opposite direction, making you can go back and forth from one side to the other if you want, making this alternating wider stud, much wider than the standard barbs on this wire. And this is a good thing if you've got, say, a portion of a fret that won't stay in the slot, or in this case where for whatever reason the Tang on these frets is just a little narrow. This will, make up for that, and I'm not having to fill the fret slots or something. And of course, varying the pressure, I get different amounts of deflection. So there is a bit of a learning curve on using this. The other thing is, if you put a whole lot of these in it, it tends to straighten the fret out a bit. I lose some of the radius. So if I'm going to use this thing, I have to slightly overbend the fret wire before starting. After that, fretting proceeds as it usually does. I tap in the ends and give it a squeeze and clean up any glue squeeze out. These days I tend to glue the extension in a separate operation. It's just neater for me. Here I'm doing the preliminary dressing of the fret ends by looking at the light between the file and the board. When it gets close, I can switch to a different kind of file, so I'm not scraping up the lacquer, just working directly on the fret end, getting rid of any sharpness. There's a bunch of excess fret height that needs to be planed down by filing. I went and recrowned every fret for a nicer playing experience. They were really flat on the top. And then polishing, polishing, polishing. I need to make a new saddle, because the original is now, of course, too low. It also had a partial shim under it, which did not spark joy. I know it's ready when I can push it in, pick up the guitar, and yet still be able to remove it with my fingers. Is this stock footage of sanding a radius on the saddle? Oh, you'll never know. I have to fix the vicious wound. I filled it with some super glue, scraped it, sanded it, and then shielded everything I didn't want overspray on, and then shot on a couple of coats of lacquer. So I just put the strings on, and we are in exactly the same position we were before I started any of this work. The action is precisely the same, but this time we've got a lot of extra saddle to work with. So I can take this down by a 1/16 of an inch. We'll get the right action, and we'll still have a break angle. I'm marking the amount to be removed from the bottom of the saddle, which is twice the distance I want to lower the action, and I'll saw and sand to the line. I'm marking the intonation points for each string, then I'll file and sand those, and end up with something that looks just about right. I'm happy with the way it turned out. The action is now 5/64ths on the bass, 4 on the treble. So that's pretty good. I can live with that.